The view is that physical properties are forms of consciousness. There isn't a divide here. Matter is consciousness. Science tells us what it does. Consciousness is what it is.
Dr. Philip Goff is an associate professor of philosophy at Durham University. His research focuses on how to integrate consciousness into our scientific worldview. He has authored an academic book with Oxford University Press, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, and a book aimed at a general audience, Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. Goff has published 45 academic articles, as well as writing extensively for newspapers and magazines, including Scientific American, The Guardian, and the Times Literary Supplement. In this episode, we talk about Pan Psychism and the hard problem of consciousness, understanding that you can't capture experience with mathematics. You're listening to Going Conscious, the podcast where we discover new ways to live a more conscious life of fulfillment and freedom. Each week, I speak with entrepreneurs, academics, and changemakers who have made big transformations, left unfulfilling lives behind, and found meaning in this new world where purpose drives success. Let's get inspired to live our unique journeys to the fullest. Let's explore the impact we want to make and deepen our understanding of ourselves, each other, and this beautiful world around us. Live your freedom. I'm your host, Nikki Trott. In this episode, we talk about how consciousness is not an abstract intellectual puzzle, but core to the human experience. The problem built into the way science was designed, the connection between biological evolution and consciousness, why matter is consciousness. We ask, is there a purpose to everything? Where philosophers and scientists come together, why consciousness is a taboo topic, why science can be a crutch just like religion, tree intelligence, trusting mystical experiences, why only believing in a narrow view leads to an impoverished human experience, and rethinking our picture of the universe. Now let's go to our conversation. So Philip, hello and welcome to Going Conscious.
Hi, good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm really excited about having this conversation with you today. You're a professor of philosophy and consciousness is your focus at Durham in the UK. And so I really wanted to start with consciousness, especially as the name of the podcast is Going Conscious. And I know it's such a widely used word in so many different contexts and can be pretty confusing. And I've heard you define consciousness as experience. So I wanted to ask you firstly to tell us a little bit more about this definition of consciousness.
Yeah, it's a good place to start because, as you say, the word is used in lots of different ways in different contexts. Often people use it to mean something quite sophisticated, like the awareness of one's own existence, something we might confine to humans or certain higher animals. But the way I tend to use the word and the way it's generally used in philosophy is just to mean any kind of experience. So, right now you're having an auditory experience of my voice speaking to you, visual experience of the room around you. If you pay attention, you can notice the subtle tactile sensations of the chair beneath your body. So these are all forms of conscious experience, all part of what it's like to be you. So that's all we mean by consciousness, really, just what it's like to be you. So yeah, sometimes people say the mystery of consciousness is nobody knows what it is. I don't agree with that way of putting it, actually. I think in a way, nothing is more evident and obvious than the reality of your own feelings. If you're in pain, you know what pain is just by feeling it. I think the mystery is more to do with how consciousness fits into our overall theory of reality.
Yes. So how it fits into our overall view of reality. And you wrote your book, Galileo's Error, where you explain how Galileo decided that mathematics would be the language of the new science, a really purely quantitative language. And so you tell us in your book how Galileo actually never really intended mathematics to be seen as a full description of reality, and that he intentionally extracted consciousness. So what is the difficulty that science is now facing, kind of having built everything on mathematics or quantitative mathematics?
Yeah, well, so I mean, the core of this is what's become known as the hard problem of consciousness, the challenge of understanding how the brain produces consciousness, how it manages to generate this inner world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes that each of us enjoys every second of waking life. And I think, for a long time, the hope was that we could somehow explain consciousness in terms of the story we get from neuroscience, the story of very complicated electrochemical signaling. But I think the problem with that is that, and this links to what you were just getting towards, that neuroscience and physical science more generally, works with a purely quantitative description of reality, whereas consciousness involves these qualities. If you think about the redness of a red experience, or the smell of coffee, or the taste of mint, these colors and sounds and smells and tastes. And you can't capture those kinds of qualities in the purely quantitative language of neuroscience. So as long as your description of the brain is framed in this purely quantitative language, you really just leave out these qualities, and hence really leave out consciousness itself. And so I think more and more scientists and philosophers are starting to think that traditional, conventional scientific approach, we just can't really make coherent sense of it, and so we need to kind of look to alternatives. But yeah, I mean, this links. So what I try to press in my book Galileo's Error is that we shouldn't be surprised that science, our conventional scientific approach, struggles to deal with consciousness, because it was actually designed to exclude consciousness. So Galileo wanted science to be purely mathematical, purely quantitative. He declared in 1623 that from this point onwards, science would be purely mathematical. But he understood quite well that you can't capture the qualities of experience in these terms, the colors, the sounds, the smells, the tastes. So he said, well, if we want science to be mathematical, we have to put consciousness outside of it. That's just in the soul, outside of the domain of science. So he essentially gave science a more narrow, focused task. And that's gone really well. And it's gone so well, I think we're now in a period of history where people think, oh my God, that's everything. That's the whole truth, because it's gone so well. Whereas the irony is, it's gone so well precisely because it was focused on such a narrow task, and quite explicitly a task that was designed to exclude consciousness. So I think if we now want to solve the hard problem of consciousness, we need to not give up on science, but rethink the approach to science bequeathed to us by Galileo, which was quite explicitly designed not to deal with consciousness.
It's so interesting how it was really specifically designed by Galileo to be this way, but it's been somehow taken to be the whole truth. I think also by the general public, the way that we understand our world is so based on this mathematical science. And I'm wondering, are there any downsides for us as human beings from omitting consciousness, from our understanding of ourselves and our world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this isn't just a kind of abstract intellectual puzzle. I think consciousness is at the root, the core of human identity. I think fundamentally we relate to each other as beings with feelings and experiences. I think consciousness is arguably the basis of everything that really matters in life, from deep emotions to visual experiences to subtle thoughts. And yet our current worldview doesn't have a place for it. And to appreciate that, I invite listeners to just attend to the qualities of what it's like to be you right now. The colors around you, for example. Our official worldview tells us that those qualities don't really exist. That all that's really going on in your head is the purely quantitative story of electrochemical signaling. So I think we've reached a really strange time when our official worldview denies the existence of the thing that's most evident and the thing that gives human life value. And so I think this can lead to somehow a deep sense of alienation, or a sense that our worldview just doesn't kind of make sense somehow, and it doesn't allow us to make sense of the meaning and value of our lives. And I think this can have real world implications. I think when your worldview doesn't make sense, people look to alternative ways of making sense of the meaning of their lives. Consumerism, nationalism, conspiracy theories, fundamentalist religion. So I think, we need to somehow come to a worldview that makes sense and that allows us to accommodate the things of value and meaning in human existence. And so, yeah, so it's not only one of the deepest mysteries of contemporary science, this so-called hard problem of consciousness, but I think it has real ramifications for lived human experience.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, this kind of lack of a full understanding of our experience and our world around us then leads us to look for meaning or deeper meaning in other areas, which can then, like you said, lead to consumerism and nationalism. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So, how can we address this? That's what you're doing with your work.
Yeah, so the view I myself defend. So when I studied philosophy, we were taught that there were just two options really. Either you took this conventional scientific approach, and I've been talking about some of the problems there that more people are coming to appreciate, or you just thought it was kind of in the soul, supernatural. We can't make any sense of it. We just leave it alone. And I actually got really disillusioned. I kind of sort of left academia altogether for a while. But then I discovered this middle way approach known as Pan Psychism, which sounds a bit wacky at first, but I think offers a way of avoiding the problems with both of these extreme views that have dominated previously. So yeah, so should I tell you about that, or?
Yes, please. I think some of our listeners won't be aware of what panpsychism is. So would
Mm.
love to hear a definition from you and an explanation. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess in our normal way of thinking about things, consciousness just exists in the brains of highly evolved organisms, and so only really exists in a tiny part of the universe, and only in very recent history. I mean, cosmically speaking, at least. But according to panpsychism, consciousness pervades the universe and is a fundamental feature of it. So it doesn't literally mean everything is conscious, actually, contrary to the meaning of the word, the etymology. Pan means everything, and psyche means mind. So literally, it means everything has mind. But the basic commitment is that the fundamental building blocks of reality, perhaps fundamental particles like electrons and quarks, have incredibly simple forms of experience, and that the very, very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow derived from the experience of the brain's most basic parts. So rather than, we've tried for many decades of trying to explain consciousness in terms of utterly non-conscious processes in the brain, and I think we've got precisely nowhere with that. This is an alternative explanatory paradigm. Rather than explain consciousness in terms of non-consciousness, we explain complex consciousness in terms of simpler forms of consciousness, simple forms of consciousness that are then postulated to exist as basic constituents of matter. Yeah, so that's the basic idea.
So can you give us an example?
Yeah, so there are many different ways of cashing this out, and it's an ongoing research program. I mean, if you think by analogy, Darwin's idea of natural selection, before Darwin, there was just no real scientific story about how complex life could have come to be. But then what Darwin gives us is, that basic principle of evolution by natural selection gives us, in very broad brushstrokes, a general explanation. But then, of course, you have to fill in the details, and it takes a century to get to DNA. So, I think the analogous insight here to Darwin's insight was by the philosopher and Nobel laureate Bertrand Russell in the 1920s, and the idea was also developed by the scientist Arthur Eddington, who's who was the first scientist to experimentally confirm Einstein's general theory of relativity. So I often say I think of these two guys as the Darwins of consciousness, and I think it's a tragedy that it got forgotten about for so long, but it's recently been rediscovered in academic philosophy and is causing huge amount of excitement and lots of publications. So what I try to do in my book Galileo's Error is to sort of get this basic idea to a more general audience. So the basic insight of Russell and Eddington was that physics doesn't really tell us what matter is. And that kind of seems like a really bizarre claim. I mean, I remember first reading that and thinking that's ridiculous. You study physics, you learn about space and time and matter, we all love that stuff. But actually, they were right that upon reflection, it turns out that for all its richness, physics is confined to telling us about what stuff does, how it behaves. Physics talks about mass and charge, and it totally defines these things in terms of attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. This is all about what stuff does. So physics tells us not what an electron is, but what an electron does, not what a field is, but what it does. It's like, as I sometimes say, doing physics is like playing chess when you don't know what the pieces are made of. You just want to know what stuff does, so you know what moves you can make, what pieces you can take. Okay, so there's this sort of huge hole in our standard scientific story of the universe. So Russell and Eddington thought, well, we're looking for a place for consciousness. We've got this hole. Maybe we can put consciousness in the hole. So the idea is there's just matter, there's just particles, fields. Physics tells us what this stuff does, but consciousness is what it is. Physics doesn't tell you what an electron is. And so that leaves open the theoretical possibility that an electron is a very simple form of consciousness. So why would you think that? Well, because it gives us this new way of addressing the hard problem of consciousness, one of the deepest mysteries of contemporary science. So that's the broad brushstroke genius idea from the 1920s that is, I think, the analog of Darwin's natural selection. But of course, then you have to fill in the details, and people have different approaches. I mean, I could talk you through different approaches and the one I favor, but what we're finding now is scientists and philosophers coming together to lay the foundations for this new approach to consciousness. There's actually, I'm quite excited. There's in October a special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies with essays prompted by my book Galileo's Error. But we've got not only philosophers but great physicists like Carlo Rovelli and Sean Carroll and neuroscientists like Christoph Koch. And so, I mean, obviously, these are both critiques of panpsychism, but as well as some scientists positively defending this view and coming together with philosophers to lay the foundations for this new approach. So it's very exciting times.
Incredible. So with philosophers and scientists coming together on panpsychism, does this mean that you think it might be possible to somehow fit consciousness into our worldview based on science, or is it about creating something that's kind of new altogether?
So it's not about saying science can't explain consciousness. It's about rethinking what science is, because the science bequeathed to us by Galileo was explicitly designed to exclude consciousness. So it's about rethinking how we understand what science is. And I think already we have the basic idea which does solve the problem, I believe. Just like, Darwin's big idea of natural selection, essentially, in very broad brushstrokes, solves the problem, gives us a plausible story of how complex life came to be. Similarly, Russell and Eddington's big idea, I think, gives us the bare bones of how consciousness fits in to our scientific story of the universe. This big idea that physics tells us what matter does, but what matter is forms of consciousness. So I think that big idea, in a sense, already solves the problem. But of course, the devil is in the details, and So I mean, different people favor different approaches. So Hedda Hasselmerk, who's a very good philosopher at the Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences, she spent a year in the lab of the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, who's the founder of the integrated information theory, one of our leading neuroscientific theories of consciousness. And she's worked out a version of that specific neuroscientific proposal, the integrated information theory, within the context of this general panpsychist view. And I think actually that's the closest we've got so far to a complete theory of consciousness. So I see the project really as having a sort of experimental bit and a philosophical bit. So the experimental bit is we do our neuroscience and our brain scans to try and work out which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of experience. And we try to be more systematic about that. So we try to work out in general what kinds of brain activity are necessary and sufficient for consciousness at all. And the integrated information theory is one experimental proposal that has some experimental support. But then the more theoretical or philosophical question is, well, why? Why is brain activity correlated with consciousness? Why should that be? And I don't think just doing more experiments is going to address that fundamental why question. And I think we need to make progress on that, not just by doing experiments, but by reimagining our idea of what the brain is, what matter is, what consciousness is. So I think marrying this Russell Eddington panpsychist view with specific scientific proposals like the integrated information theory is really leading us forward.
Amazing. Such collaboration from people from so many different fields to solve this puzzle. And so why do you think panpsychism is not more widely accepted today?
Well, actually, I mean, a lot has changed in recent times. 10 years ago, when I was first looking for an academic job, I was told by well-meaning professors, maybe don't mention the panpsychism. You won't get a job. But, now it's become, a really, probably still a minority view, but, a really well-respected position that's taken very seriously, and I have graduate students from all over the world coming to work with me. And also with the integrated information theory, which points in a panpsychist direction. That's another reason things are getting taken so much seriously. And, moving back a little bit further in time, for most of the 20th century, consciousness was just a taboo topic. It was thought not to be the proper subject matter of serious science. You couldn't get a job if you wanted to work on the science of consciousness because, the high point of this is maybe that the behaviorists of the 40s who thought that, the only proper subject matter for a science of the mind is behavior, because it's behavior you can see and you can study in the lab, this funny invisible feelings and experiences. So, since the 1990s, a lot has changed, and we now do take this hard problem of consciousness very seriously. But I think, although the problem's taken very seriously, I think people haven't totally absorbed the philosophical underpinnings of the problem. I think people still think, oh, it's just another scientific problem. We just need to plug away with our standard ways of investigating the brain and we'll crack it. I think what people are starting to see now is, no, this is a problem that's built into the way science was designed. Another way of saying that is that consciousness is not publicly observable. You can't look in my head and see my feelings and experiences. And that makes it radically different from any other scientific problem. And with any other scientific explanatory task, what we're trying to explain ultimately is the data of public observation and experiments. We might postulate things we can't observe, like particles, but we do them in order to explain what we can observe, the data of public experiments. Consciousness is not known about in that way. We didn't discover consciousness with an experiment, we know about consciousness because each of us is immediately aware of our feelings and our experiences. So it's radically different from any other scientific problem. And I think that the thing that's most going to change and is starting to change is just get. I know I don't try to start with panpsychism. I just try and get people to see that this is a radically different explanatory project than any other scientific project. And I think once the penny clicks, penny drops. What do pennies do? Penny drops with that. Then I think people start to see the problem just very differently, really, and see what a kind of a radical revolution is required in order to address this. Essentially, we need a second scientific revolution.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, a radical revolution of science. And it's really interesting because you talk about how this consciousness that we all experience it, but it's not something that can be observed. And I suppose that we all experience it very differently, and very differently even for each of us at different points in our own lives as we develop and change and grow and connect and disconnect. And I think it makes me wonder, as conscious beings that we are, whether we can really truly learn or study consciousness when we are conscious beings ourselves.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, another way of pointing to the why consciousness is such a challenge is that it's essentially subjective.
Mm.
You can only know about someone's consciousness by adopting their perspective. And science in general tries to have an utterly objective picture of reality. A theory that you could understand no matter what your life experience or your background. So, if aliens came from another planet, maybe they'd have very different sense organs. Maybe they wouldn't understand our art or our music. But if they were intelligent enough to know mathematics, they could understand our physics. So the philosopher Thomas Nagel put this by saying that science aims for the view from nowhere. Now, if you're going for the view from nowhere, you can't understand consciousness because consciousness is the view from somewhere. As Nagel also said, a very famous paper from the 1970s called What's It Like to Be a Bat? He said, no matter how much we learn about the neurophysiology of bats, there's always something we'll miss out on, namely what it's like to be a bat, because it's such an alien mode of existence, echolocating your way around the world, bouncing sound off stuff. And, we can't adopt that perspective. And so we'll never really know what it's like to be a bat. So there are many ways in which this is, there are deep challenges to, and maybe we'll never be able to fill in all the details. And, in some ways, it depends what you want to do. If what you want to understand is human consciousness, probably the best thing you should do is read some literature. Read James Joyce or something, that to understand the human perspective, the first person perspective, to understand what it's like to be a human being from the inside. So, but what I hope we can do is to try and have a worldview, a picture of the universe that allows us to understand, at least in quite general terms, how human consciousness emerges, gives some sort of intelligible story of how our minds came to be. I think that is something we can hopefully address scientifically, but I think, as I've said, I think we need to really rethink how we approach science, and I think fundamentally that's a philosophical task as well as an experimental one.
Yes. So I believe that panpsychism says that consciousness has always been here. So I think this means it can't have evolved from something biological. Does panpsychism bring to light anything about where consciousness might have come from?
So the panpsychist view, as you say, yes, is that consciousness was there from the start, and there are different ways of interpreting this depending on how you think of physics, really. So typically, we tend to think of panpsychism as thinking of the fundamental building blocks of reality as fundamental particles with incredibly simple forms of experience. But actually, many theoretical physicists actually are inclined to think that the fundamental components of reality are not particles, but universe-wide fields. and that particles are just sort of local excitations in those fields. So if you combine that view with panpsychism, we end up with a sort of cosmopsychism, that the fundamental forms of consciousness are the intrinsic nature of these universe-wide fields. But I mean, in either case, although consciousness, as I say, consciousness, we need to not anthropocentrically think of it in terms of human consciousness, which is the product of millions of years of evolution. So the idea would be that human experience is very rich and complex, but if you think about the experience of a horse is much simpler. The experience of a mouse is simpler still. If bed bugs have consciousness, it's so much more simpler. And as we keep going down to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of experience. So for the panpsychist, this just keeps on going down, right down to the level of fundamental physics. So there was some experience always there, but what evolution did was take those elementary forms of consciousness and find a way of molding them into much more complex forms of consciousness. So actually, I mean, from early on in after Darwin, many people actually, such as the great psychologist William James, saw how well panpsychism fits with Darwinism, actually. Because if you're not a panpsychist, you sort of think, well, there's this complex life evolving, and then at some point a miracle happens and consciousness appears. Whereas for the panpsychist, consciousness was always there, but it was molded into more complex forms over millions of years. But actually, I'm like a politician. Actually, I haven't addressed your question, have I? Which is, where did consciousness come in the beginning? Well, I think given that consciousness was there from the Big Bang, really, the question is the old deep philosophical question: why is there something rather than nothing? Where did the universe come from? And I don't know. I mean, I'm fascinated by that question. I'm not sure I've got a great answer to it, but I mean, I think that's really a deep mystery for anyone, whether you're a panpsychist or not. You have to start with something, some physical or spiritual reality, and then you'll always have that philosophical problem: why does anything exist? But that's a problem for everyone, I think,
Yes,
unfortunately.
true. Yeah, really at the basis of every single idea or thought. If you enjoy Going Conscious, please subscribe for a new episode every Wednesday. If you think your friends and networks would benefit from listening, please share this podcast of fulfillment and freedom with them. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please rate and review. It's great to read what you think, and your support makes a big difference. Together, let's grow our courage and tools to transform and live the lives we really want to. As well as creating Going Conscious, I work as a transformation coach and conscious brand consultant. I'm on a mission to help holistically maximize conscious entrepreneurs to drive positive changes for themselves, others, and the planet. I can help you to transition and level up personally, and I can help your brand grow and make a bigger impact. To connect with me and find out more about how we can work together, find me on Instagram @NikkiTrott or on my website nikkitrott.com. Please get in touch. I'd love to hear from you, and let's talk about your path of growth and development. I love how you talk about this biological evolution and then the kind of molding of consciousness and this connection between them. I've been thinking of it a bit more separated, but actually, do you mean to suggest that evolution, that even the purpose of evolution could have been linked to a purpose for consciousness?
Yeah, so it's a radically non-dualist philosophy. So it's not, people sometimes when they hear panpsychism, they think it's the idea that particles have their physical properties like mass, spin, and charge, and then these strange consciousness properties as well. And the physicist Sabine Hossenfelder had a blog post on panpsychism a couple of years ago where she interpreted panpsychism in this way, and she criticized it, saying, well, we don't find these, strange consciousness properties when we do science. But that's not the view. The view is that physical properties are forms of consciousness. There isn't a divide here. Matter is consciousness. Science tells us what it does. Consciousness is what it is. So matter is what consciousness does. So really on this view, there just is consciousness. That's all there is. And when you do physics, you're learning about what consciousness does. You don't know that's what you're doing because it's, as I say, it's like playing chess when you don't know what the pieces do. But that's all there is. So matter and consciousness are sort of two sides of the same coin. But then you asked an interesting question there. Is evolution part of the purpose of consciousness? So the basic panpsychist theory would leave that open. But there are some philosophers in recent times. A very interesting book from 2012, again by Thomas Nagel, who's already come up in this conversation, called Mind and Cosmos, where he suggests that there are certain aspects of human existence, such as reason itself, such as our moral awareness, also the cosmological fine-tuning we find at the beginning of the universe. There are certain features of human existence that we can't explain in our current scientific paradigm of Darwinian evolution by natural selection. And so he didn't go for the traditional God solution, that sort of God is kind of messing around and fiddling with things. He rather went back to the old idea of natural teleology. So teleology meaning purpose. So before the scientific revolution, Aristotle, our worldview is inherited from the philosopher Aristotle, who thought things had sort of aims or directionality built into them. Organisms in particular, Aristotle thought as having aims built into them, but also the constituents of physical reality. So Nagel thinks, for example, he has a kind of panpsychist worldview, but also one which involves this natural teleology or directionality of nature, as part of the engine of evolution. So it's not merely natural selection, but this inherent directionality in nature. So that's a very controversial question. That's not something all panpsychists would agree on. But yeah, I think it's a live issue, and there's so many things here we don't quite have a grip on, and it's good to be open-minded about where science might lead us.
Yes, and I'm so fascinated by this idea that there is directionality, there is purpose, and that everything is interlinked and moving towards something that's probably beyond our comprehension. Sometimes I feel like we can get little glimpses into that and then kind of retract to just the boundaries of what we can really process.
Yeah, I think one of the strongest evidence for this. I'm a bit agnostic on what Nagel says about human beings, but the incredible discovery of the last 40 years in physics, that many of the numbers in physics, such as the strength of gravity or the weight of electrons or the cosmological constant, which measures the expansion rate of the universe, these numbers are exactly as they need to be to allow the possibility of life. If they'd been very slightly different, life would have been impossible. And physicists tell us, because of this, the probability of a life-sustaining universe, the odds are incredibly stacked against it, more than astronomically stacked against it. And yet all those numbers are precisely as they need to be for life to be possible. So, many people, scientists and philosophers, think this can't be fluke. Something needs explaining. What a lot of scientists go for is the multiverse hypothesis. So they claim, okay, well, what must be going on here is there's not just our universe, but there's huge, perhaps infinite number of different universes, each with different numbers in their physics. Gravity's a bit stronger or a bit weaker. Electrons are a bit heavier or a bit lighter. So if you've got enough universes with different physics, then one of them's going to fluke the right numbers for life. So it's like monkeys on typewriters. If you've got an infinite number of monkeys typing away for an infinite number of years, one of them's going to just accidentally type out Shakespeare by fluke. And I was actually myself persuaded by that for a long time. But what I've come across actually is some kind of cutting edge work by the philosophers of probability, identifying a pretty straightforward logical fallacy in the very popular inference from the fine tuning to the multiverse. So I have a paper in, maybe we won't go into the details now, but I have a paper in an article in Scientific American quite recently, because it's actually it's a couple of decades old, this insight, but it's been stuck in, everything's so specialized now, and this has been stuck in the very technical probability journals. So I was happy to get this across to a general audience in a popular article. So I actually now think trying to explain this in terms of a multiverse is just logically fallacious, is just a non-starter. And so I really think we just have to face up to the fact that it looks like we have evidence, unbelievably strong evidence, that the very early stages of the universe were somehow shaped by considerations of value. That's really weird, hard to make sense of. People don't like that. It's not used to how we're thinking of science. But I think, the spirit of the Enlightenment is you follow the evidence where it leads. And I really think that's where the evidence of physics is leading us.
Wow. I'll have to ask you to send me that paper or the article so that we can include it in the notes. It sounds incredible. And yes, isn't it
Oh, thank
fascinating,
you.
this resistance that we feel to changing of the way that we think that we see the world
Yeah,
rather than following the evidence and the truth which
yeah.
is emerging?
I think essentially there was about 100 or so years between Darwin and the discovery of the fine tuning, when there was just absolutely no evidence for teleology or purpose in the physical world. And that really hammered home in people's minds this sort of, you know, break between science and religion, and this idea that science has disproved all this stuff. And that really gets into your identity, doesn't it? And your sense of who you are. People talk about religion as a crutch, but I think a certain kind of scientism is for many people a kind of crutch. And now I think the evidence has changed. And the great economist Keynes said, when someone said to him, you didn't used to say that, and he said, well, when the facts change, I change my mind. But it's very hard to do that. People are naturally conservative, and so I think we're really in a period of denial about lots of things, about consciousness and about the fine tuning in particular. But I think the fine tuning evidence is so overwhelming, and the reality of consciousness is so undeniable, that I think I have faith in humanity that things have to change eventually, and I think they slowly are. It's just well, who's the great physicist who put it rather coldly by saying science progresses one funeral at a time? That's a bit of a kind of dark way of saying it, but I think things take time to change.
Yes, indeed, always. And I love how you describe how science can be a crutch as well. I completely agree. So you've explained to us how matter is consciousness. And so I'm wondering, does this mean then that all matter in the universe is conscious in some way?
Yeah, that's the basic idea. So as I say, it doesn't necessarily mean literally everything is conscious. That the fundamental building blocks of reality are conscious, but it doesn't
Mm.
mean that every random arrangement of particles makes something that's conscious in its own right. So it doesn't mean rocks and socks and tables and chairs are conscious. It just means that the things they're ultimately made of have some kind of very, very rudimentary experience, not at all like a human experience. It's not like the particles are sitting there feeling bored or feeling existential angst or something. That's something specifically human. But yeah, I mean, some panpsychists, there's a lot of different views. Some panpsychists do think literally everything is conscious. The very good panpsychist philosopher Luke Roelofs holds something like this view. My own view, I'm more inclined to think that the conditions under which simple conscious things combine to form more complex conscious things are quite rare, and that evolution, as it were, discovered this and exploited it. So I'm inclined to think the biological realm is filled with consciousness. Cells are conscious, molecules are conscious. I think our bodies are filled with consciousness, not just the consciousness I call mine. You know, so I'm probably inclined to think that outside of, and this of course changes your relationship with nature. If you think the forest is teeming with consciousness. We had I had a philosopher doing a talk at our university department a couple of weeks ago, talking about this phenomenon that many countries have given legal rights to forests, and this philosopher was struggling to make sense of this. How can we give moral legal rights to trees? And of course, if you think of a tree as a mechanism, that kind of doesn't make sense. You can't give rights to a mechanism. But if you think of a tree as a conscious organism in its own right, then it makes perfect sense to start to treat it with moral respect and to think of it as something with rights, in the way philosophers like Peter Singer have started to think of animals as having moral rights. So I'm inclined to think the biological realm is filled with consciousness, but outside of the biological realm, maybe consciousness is just at the level of fundamental physics, either particles or universe-wide fields. So the universe is full of consciousness, but maybe only at the level of fundamental physics.
Yes. And wow, we'll have to speak to Monica Gagliano, who I had on the podcast earlier, whose work is all about plant consciousness, about the trees. But
Yeah.
I think it's incredible that forests are being given rights, even if we don't understand really how to frame them from our human position. But I wanted to ask you then, I mean, what impact does understanding panpsychism have on our relationship with our environment and on environmentalism?
Yeah, no, this is something I talk about it a lot in the book, and the incredible scientific research on tree consciousness, on tree intelligence, and the incredible ways, what's called the wood wide web, the incredible ways in which trees are connected up in communities under the ground, and help each other out between species. It's hard enough for human beings to help each other out across kind of national boundaries, but trees, the evergreen trees help out the deciduous trees during the winter, and this is reciprocated in summer. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. So yeah, I think it does. I think it does radically transform your picture of nature. So if you think of a plant is just a mechanism, then it really has no value in its own right. Its value is what it can do for us, either in looking nice or sustaining our existence. But if we think of it as a conscious organism, if we think of its movements as in some way expressing its interests and its preferences, imagine a child raised in a panpsychist worldview relating to trees and plants as seeing their movements as reflecting their interests. I think it does radically transform your relationship with nature. You see these things as having moral importance in their own right. I mean, I kind of think actually that the Cultural Revolution in the 60s maybe didn't have, in science more generally, the kind of intellectual underpinnings to sustain it. But I think those intellectual underpinnings are now emerging with the resurgence of interest in panpsychism, the work of Gagliano, as you said, and others. And so, maybe we can return to that more healthy relationship with nature. But the only problem is time is so pressing with the environment. But
Indeed, we need more people to learn about panpsychism ASAP. Yeah, amazing. And so, how does a panpsychist worldview affect spirituality? I know that's a broad question.
yeah, so a couple of things. I suppose I always do want to emphasize that there's no necessary connection with panpsychism and spirituality, like that, because everyone assumes it's essentially a spiritual view, but many panpsychist philosophers like David Chalmers and Luke Roelofs, who I mentioned earlier, are total, secularist, don't believe in any kind of spiritual reality. But what they do believe in is consciousness, feelings, and experiences. That's just totally undeniable, and so they want a scientific explanation of those things. So that's the first thing to say. Having said that, I guess I do think if for independent reasons you do have certain spiritual convictions, I think panpsychism is a worldview more consonant with those convictions. So, for example, and I talk about this also in the book, so the the first 4 chapters of my book are the kind of cold-blooded scientific philosophical case for the probable truth of panpsychism. But then the final chapter is, exploring its implications for lived human existence with the environment, with spirituality, politics, and so on. So I think it does make a difference, because suppose you take mystical experiences seriously. Maybe you have a mystical experience one day, and you have this experience in which it seems to you there's this higher form of consciousness underlying all things. Now, if you're a materialist, you've got to think that's just a delusion, right? Because your worldview tells you what's going on at the fundamental level is just what we learn from physics, and there doesn't seem to be any consciousness there. But if you're a panpsychist, and you already think that there is consciousness of some kind at the fundamental level, then it's not much of a leap to think that what you're acquainted with in the mystical experience is part of that consciousness at the fundamental level. So it removes your reason to doubt. But I mean, you've still got the old question, well, but what positive reason do you have to believe or to trust mystical experiences? And I talk a little bit about in my book about one of the greatest things written on mystical experience, I think, is still the classic text chapter on mystical experiences from William James's classic The Varieties of Religious Experience. So most of this chapter is just a psychological study of mystical experiences as a psychological category. But then towards the end of the chapter, he raises the question, suppose you have a mystical experience, you feel there's this higher consciousness at the root of things or whatever. Is it rational for you to trust that experience, to take it seriously as something that's telling you about the nature of reality? And many people would say, no, of course not. It could be just something, caused by your brain. But then James points out, well, actually, all experiences could be delusions. We could be in the Matrix. We could be having a very vivid dream. All knowledge starts with trusting experience. There's no way you can prove any of your experiences correspond to something real. So James thinks there's a sort of double standard if you say it's okay for us to take our ordinary sensory experiences seriously about telling us that there's a physical world out there, but it's not okay for the mystic to take their experiences seriously as telling them about reality. There's a sort of double standard there. And so, yeah, I think that's the very thought-provoking thing that I still wrestle with, although I've never yet had a mystical experience, so I don't have to totally make my mind up.
I love how he puts that, though. And I also think that we are far more willing to accept experiences that are widely accepted or described by other people. And somehow, I think it does come down to trust. And if we have an experience with other people might cast doubt upon, it somehow causes us to doubt it ourselves. I had this weird experience when I was a child and I was singing in the Colosseum in London in the Nutcracker. And me and one other from my choir saw a figure going up some stairs, and we were so compelled to leave our single file and follow her. And then she disappeared behind this locked door. And we could only describe that as a ghost, what we've been told ghosts were. And it was so strange because we both saw the same thing, but couldn't believe it. And actually, I spoke to one of the chaperones because we were under 18 and we had these chaperones, and she said, I see ghosts all the time. And it was, I was like, what? Okay. But still, I never believed that. And I find that so interesting that I saw something just as clear as I can see the flowers on my table right now in front of me. And so did somebody else, but we still couldn't believe it. So I do think that it's a lot to do with what we feel is acceptable and what we've been told we will see. And I think that we're really filtering our experience through that lens.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I suppose, I think there's a modern focus on sort of belief. And actually, the historian Karen Armstrong has argued that's a sort of modern corruption, a kind of mistranslation of the word faith in religious texts. When the Bible, for example, was originally translated, the word believe meant something much closer to the German belieben, to love, and believe meant something much closer to engage, to trust, to commit. And then as time goes on, it comes to mean the modern sense of kind of intellectual assent to a hypothesis. So now, if you read the Bible, you think, oh God, Jesus really cared about, what your theories of reality are, and salvation depends on it. Whereas really what was meant by faith is sort of, commitment, engagement, trust. So I think, I've never had the kind of experience you've just talked about, but I suppose in my deeper moral experiences or deeper experience of beauty, or prolonged periods of meditation, I do have a fleeting sense of a greater reality that I find hard to characterize. Now I could ask myself, do I believe that? Do I feel it's definitely corresponds to something real? That's one question. Another question is, am I willing to engage that, to trust it, to work with it, to commit to it in some sense? And I think, I think that's the more relevant question. So I think we should think of spiritual commitments more on the line of trust rather than belief, working with something, engaging with it, rather than, do I know for sure it's real or not? So, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I describe myself as a kind of practicing agnostic. So, I kind of, I don't know whether it's true, but I get a lot of nourishment from engaging, and with specific religion. I engaging, I can connect with my community and celebrating rites of passage, marking the seasons, and connecting with what seems to be a reality greater than myself. So, that's doesn't really matter to me. Oh, how do we know for sure this is real? I don't think we really know that about anything. But I think you can get a lot of spiritual nourishment from engaging with these experiences in a kind of structured and communal way.
Yes, yes. And I think we have to trust ourselves first. Otherwise, how can we really trust anything if we don't trust our own experience?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's that. If you're just going to go with what you know for certain, you'll be stuck with your experience right now. You don't even know whether your memory. You have to trust your memories even to learn about the past.
Mm.
And this is what Descartes wrestled with at the start of the scientific revolution. And he tried to solve this, and he thought he could prove the existence of God. And then he thought God would never deceive us. And so we can trust our senses because God wouldn't give us senses that would deceive us. And no one thinks that work, ultimately. So, we're either stuck with solipsism, stuck in our own heads, or we've got to trust experiences. And everyone thinks it's okay to trust our memories and to trust, in a cautious way, and to trust our senses. So why not also trust our deepest moral and spiritual experiences tentatively and with humility? But why not?
Yes, yes. So, Philip, I would love to ask you, how did you discover this path for yourself with your work?
Oh God, I guess I've always been obsessed with philosophy as long as I can remember, really, and I guess obsessed with things that it's hard to fit into reality. Not it's not really because I like mystery, it's because I want to fit everything in. Sort of, so things that it's hard to fit in, like free will is another one. How do we fit our sense of human agency into the scientific story of the universe, or consciousness, or facts about value, or facts about abstract objects? Mathematicians study these timeless objects like numbers and sets. How do they fit into our story of the physical universe? But I think consciousness is always been for me the most interesting, because it's the one that's most hard to deny. Many people deny maybe we're not really free in the way we think we are. Maybe there aren't really objective facts about right and wrong. Maybe it's just about our subjective preferences. Some people even think mathematics is a sort of useful fiction. But with our own consciousness, our own feelings and experiences. It's so hard to deny that these things are real. It's so hard to say, well, actually, no one's ever felt pain or no one's ever seen color. And yet it's so hard to fit into our scientific story of reality. And I think ultimately we're going to have to completely rethink our picture of the universe in order to accommodate it. But we know it exists, so that's what we've got to do.
Mm. And so, as you've delved deeper and deeper into consciousness with your work, has it changed your life and the way that you see things in your personal kind of existence?
Yeah, I think it has, because when I studied philosophy, we were taught that there were only these two options, and initially I tried to defend the materialist option, and I thought that was the scientifically credible option, and I debated it and I defended it, but I just came to see that for all the reasons we've been talking about, if you really go for that worldview, it really implies that consciousness doesn't really exist. And for a while, I actually believed that. I would debate people and say, you know, consciousness doesn't really exist. It's just an illusion created by, it's a trick of the brain. We don't really have feelings and experiences. And there was, as I talk about in the book, there was just one evening, just sitting in a bar, drinking a beer, and you could smoke in bars those days. I think I was having a cigarette and just listening to music, and I just had a vivid sense of the reality of my own experience, and I just sort of couldn't deny it any longer. And from that moment on, I didn't know what to do. I thought, I can't accept the conventional scientific approach. I didn't like the sort of supernaturalist approach of just leaving it as a mystery. And for a while, I just tried to forget about it and do other things. And discovering panpsychism actually, it's just brought me intellectual peace. Seeing how it all makes sense, how it all fits together. So, for me, it is important to have a worldview that makes sense, and there is an intelligible sense of reality, and how things fit together. And I think, as I say, it does touch on the things of ultimate importance in human life. Without consciousness, I think nothing really is worth anything.
Mm. Without consciousness, nothing is really worth anything. I love that. So, what does personal success look like to you with your work?
Yeah, personal success. I guess I'm kind of lucky that I really believe in something, and and I want to persuade people of the truth of it. I mean, not specifically necessarily even panpsychism, but that, I mean, the basic idea that we really need to rethink our scientific approach in order to accommodate consciousness. So ultimately, and I suppose my work has two very different aspects. I have my academic work of publishing papers in academic journals, writing academic books, but also trying to connect with a broader audience. Every academic article I write now, I try to write a popular, accessible version of it. Everything is too specialized these days. So I also, think it's important to connect things up, to connect to the scientific community and the broader general public, who are curious about these matters. So I suppose the more that happens, the more I count that as success. I mean, I suppose at a more personal level, it's important to me to have, coming back to purpose and teleology, I think it's important to me to live in hope that there is a purpose to existence, and that what I do in some small way contributes to that greater purpose. Actually, I mean, one of my spiritual heroes is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a paleontologist and wildly heretical Catholic priest of the late 19th, early 20th century, who had this vision of an evolving universe, evolving towards some greater state of reality. So Teilhard de Chardin, I mean, he looked to biological history and saw these great leaps of the emergence of life, self-consciousness, reason, moral awareness. And he had faith that this process of cosmic evolution will continue. Actually, some people think he predicted the internet, because he thought the next stage of cosmic evolution would involve society becoming more informationally connected up, and he thought a new form of life and consciousness would emerge from that. And he ultimately thought the physical universe was going to become unified with God in some way. So yeah, I mean, I don't know whether Teilhard de Chardin got all the details right there, but it is important for me to live in hope that there is a point to it all, and I suppose I try to dedicate my life, not to my sort of own personal interests, but to the advancement of the universe, which sounds kind of bold, but yes, I think I found that's my view of the kind of secret of happiness, I suppose, to try, we all have our personal interests and desires, but to try as much as possible to direct oneself towards the advancement of the universe. And that's what I try to do. It's not easy.
I love that. I agree with you in my own way, in my different way. I think I have a very similar mission. I do also believe that everything in the universe is connected to some kind of greater purpose, which is evolving. And I think that we all have a purpose that's greater than ourselves, that we can contribute to that in a small way. So I love how you describe that. And
Mm.
as we come towards the end of our discussion today, is there a key message or takeaway that you would like to share?
Yeah, well, I should have a pithy answer to this, shouldn't I? I suppose I think we're in a period where our official worldview tells us that the only things we know to be real, the only things it's rational to believe in, are those known on the basis of public observation and experiment. And I think there are all sorts of things we know to be real that don't fit into that. If you religiously followed that idea, then you wouldn't believe in consciousness, because consciousness is not known about on the basis of observation and experiment. But there are other things as well that don't fit into that paradigm. Facts about value. I think we know human trafficking is abhorrent, and yet our official scientific worldview tells us we live in a meaningless universe. Or again, the reality of the kind of things mathematicians study. In mathematics departments, mathematicians generally take themselves to be discovering facts about numbers and sets. Again, these are things that are known about through mathematical intuition, not through observation and experiment. So, I think when we just go to this stripped down idea that we're only allowed to believe in things that are known about in this very narrow procedure of public observation experiment, I think it leads to a very impoverished sense of human existence. So I kind of think people should have confidence to resist that. Not go crazy. We can't just believe in whatever we want, and there are many areas in which it is the business of empirical science to settle the matters with, climate change or what have you. But I think there are other things we know to be real, the reality of our own consciousness, the reality of our own free will, the reality of value, that we shouldn't be ashamed of accepting as part of our story of what reality is like.
Mm,
So yeah, that's what I'd like to give people kind of confidence to be able to do that.
yes, thank you. And is there a book that you've read recently or just a book that you absolutely love that you can recommend to us?
Oh yeah, so I was going to say, well, this is a very different kind of book, but I was going to say 23 Things They Never Tell You About Capitalism by the Cambridge economist Hajoon Chang. And this was a book that, I don't know, it was really mind-blowing to me, and really a kind of political awakening. It's a really fun to read book because it's written in sort of short sections and each has a very controversial statement at the start, and then Hajoon Chang defends it. But what I really got from it most of all is a sort of new perspective on recent history. I think we can divide the last 70 years into two parts. I think, the 30 years after the war, we had incredibly high taxes on the wealthy, in the UK and the US, 80 or 90%. We had very strongly regulated capitalism, you couldn't freely move capital beyond borders. And the result was, for the first time in history, society got massively more equal, and we also had incredibly strong growth. And I think we had great development in lots of ways. We had the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, And then, from the 80s onwards, we've had kind of Wild West capitalism. We've slashed taxes, we've slashed regulation, and the result has been, rocketing inequality, crisis after crisis, culminating in, the huge crash of 2008, and then, a decade of the longest wage stagnation since the Napoleonic War, in fact. So, I think this is important because I think there's a lot of crazy things happening in the world at the moment. I mean, not just COVID, putting COVID on one side. And a lot of people are saying, what's going on? What's causing this? I think, future historians will look back and say, it's bloody obvious. You tried out this Wild West capitalism for the last 40 years and everything exploded. And, so I kind of think it's time to move on from that. But anyway, whether you agree with it or not, it's a very thought-provoking and fun to read book.
Great, thank you so much. And lastly, Philip, where's the best place for our listeners to find you and your work online?
I have a website, philipgoffphilosophy.com. I got lots of, as well as academic articles, popular articles, and YouTube videos and so on. Oh, I have to plug my I've got a YouTube channel I've just started called Mind Chat, and it's the idea is I have a co-presenter who is another philosopher, Keith Frankish, who doesn't believe in consciousness, right? Because he thinks science. We both think current science can't explain it. And my view, I then think, well, we need to change current science. He thinks, well, it doesn't exist. It's like witches or fairy dust. Science has proved it isn't real. So I think consciousness is everywhere. He thinks it's nowhere. And we interview scientists and philosophers of consciousness. We've just done one video so far. And so that's. And I spend too much time on Twitter, which is Philip_Goff. So just my name, Philip with one L, Goff, Goff. So, yeah. Oh, I've got a blog. It's got the worst title in the world, Conscience and Consciousness. I don't know why I came up with that. But anyway, it's linked to from my website. But I just kind of ramble on there every now and again.
It is a mouthful, but I like it. Thank you so much. It's been really great speaking with you today. Thank you so much, Philip.
Thanks very much, Nikki. I really enjoyed that. It was a great chat.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with the amazing Dr. Philip Goff. I love how he writes popular books and articles as well as academic ones to ensure that he can connect his ideas with the general public as well as the academic world. I think it's important that these conversations are not niche but are accessible. That's why we had this conversation for you today, and I hope you found it thought-provoking. It's no doubt opened up lots more fascinating questions in your mind, and I recommend that you read Philip's book, Galileo's Error, if you want to discover more. I really enjoyed our conversation about purpose. We wonder if there is a purpose to everything, and I believe that there is, and when we see that everything has a purpose, we are able to see how everything in our universe is connected and led by a singular greater purpose. Philip talks about the importance of living in hope that there's a point to it all, that the universe is advancing, and that's what Philip dedicates his life to. I love how he worded this and think that every one of us who is working towards their purpose, which means anything greater than you, is connected to their purpose in some way too. I'm interested in how personal Pan-Psychism is as well. Philip explained that it's important that we have a worldview that makes sense, otherwise we feel alienated by our experience, which does not align with the general scientific view. I loved exploring how consciousness could be accounted for and how it is not in our view based on rational observation and experiment. As Philip put it, a narrow worldview leads to an impoverished human existence. So how have your views been questioned or shifted by this episode? We mentioned the episode with Monica Gagliano as well, where we talk about plant consciousness, which I highly recommend if you haven't listened yet. Check it out. It's episode 16. She's incredibly fascinating too. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe now. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave a 5-star rating and short review. If you think people you know might benefit from listening to Going Conscious, please share it with them. I know I get much of my inspiration from podcasts which are shared with me. For all episodes, our library, and more, visit goingconscious.com. Your support to spread this positive message of fulfillment and freedom means so much. As well as hosting Going Conscious, I help conscious entrepreneurs to transition and unleash their power and purpose with my transformation coaching and conscious brand consulting work. Discover more on Instagram @NikkiTrott or on my website, nikkitrott.com. I'd love to hear from you and to talk about your goals, questions, or how we can work together. And if I don't hear from you before then, see you next Wednesday on the next episode of Going Conscious. As always, live your freedom.